My dad said, "Some things are private about our ancestry." 2 years later, I found out he's not my biological father. I was 16 when I first asked my dad about our family tree for a genealogy project at school. We were supposed to trace back 3 generations and present our findings to the class. I figured it would be easy since my dad was always talking about our Scottish heritage and how our family came over during the potato famine. But when I sat down at the kitchen table with my assignment sheet, he got this weird look on his face. "Some things are private," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "Family business should stay family business." I thought he was being dramatic, so I pressed him about dates and places. He folded the paper with sharp creases and told me to make something up if I had to. Just pick some generic Scottish names and call it good. The teacher won't fact-check a high school project. That response felt completely wrong. My dad loved talking about our ancestry. He'd spent hours telling me stories about our great-grandfather who supposedly fought in World War I and our grandmother who immigrated alone at 17. Why was he suddenly acting like family history was classified information? I tried asking my mom instead, but she deferred to Dad immediately. "Ask your father about that stuff," she said. "It's his family, not mine." When I told her what Dad had said about making things up, she got that same uncomfortable expression. Maybe he's right. Some families prefer to keep things quiet. The next week, I decided to research on my own. I went to the public library after school and started searching genealogy databases for our last name. I found hundreds of records going back to the 1800s, but none of them connected to my dad or matched the stories he'd told me. The Scottish heritage he'd always claimed seemed to be completely fabricated. I printed out what I could find and brought it home. When I showed my parents the documents that proved our name wasn't connected to Scotland at all, Dad lost it completely. He grabbed the papers out of my hands and threw them in the trash. "I told you this was private," he yelled. "Why can't you just trust me and leave it alone?" Mom stepped between us and suggested we all calm down. But I could see something in her eyes that looked like fear. Not anger or frustration, actual fear. Like I'd stumbled onto something dangerous instead of just asking normal questions about our family background. The genealogy project was due the following week, so I ended up making something up like Dad suggested. I presented a fake family tree with generic names and approximate dates. The teacher gave me an A and moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about why my parents were so secretive about something as basic as where we came from. A few months later, I was helping Mom clean out the attic when I found a box of old documents hidden behind the Christmas decorations. Inside were birth certificates, marriage licenses, and legal papers I'd never seen before. Most of them had different names than what I expected. My dad's birth certificate listed his name as David Chen, not David Murphy, like I'd grown up believing. I confronted them that night at dinner. Mom started crying immediately. Dad got angry and demanded to know why I'd been snooping through their private papers. I said I wasn't snooping. I was helping clean like they'd asked me to. Then I asked why his birth certificate had a completely different name. The room went silent for what felt like forever. Finally, Dad admitted they'd changed their names when they got married. It was for business reasons, he said. Murphy sounded more American than Chen. It helped with job applications and housing. This was the 1990s, and there was still discrimination. That explanation made some sense, but it didn't explain why they'd lied about our heritage or why they acted so scared when I asked questions. If it was just about making life easier in America, why all the secrecy? Why the elaborate stories about Scottish ancestors who never existed? I started paying closer attention to things that hadn't seemed important before, like how Dad never talked to his parents or siblings, how we never visited extended family or had relatives over for holidays, how Mom's family always seemed uncomfortable around Dad and changed the subject when I asked about his background. Then I remembered something from when I was little. We'd been at the grocery store and run into one of Mom's co-workers from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. The woman had looked at Dad and me standing together and made a comment about how I didn't look anything like my father. Mom had gotten really flustered and hurried us out of the store without finishing our shopping. At the time, I thought the woman was just being rude. People made comments like that sometimes, but now it felt significant. I started looking at photos of Dad and me together, really studying them for similarities. We had completely different facial features, different build, different coloring. I looked much more like my mom's side of the family. The thought that Dad might not be my biological father crept into my mind, but I pushed it away. That was crazy. Why would they lie about something that fundamental? But the more I thought about it, the more things started making sense. The secrecy, the fake genealogy, the way Mom's family acted around Dad. I decided to order a DNA test kit online. I used money from my part-time job at the local movie theater and had it shipped to my friend Caleb's house so my parents wouldn't see it. When it arrived, I followed the instructions and mailed the saliva sample back to the company. Then I waited 6 weeks for results that would either confirm my suspicions or prove I was being paranoid. The results came back while I was at Caleb's house doing homework. We opened the email together on his laptop. The ethnicity breakdown showed I was 47% Irish, 23% English, 18% German, and 12% Scandinavian. No Chinese ancestry at all, which should have shown up if Dad was really my biological father. More importantly, the DNA matches section showed I had a half-brother named Ryan living 2 states away. According to the website, we shared enough DNA to be half-siblings through one parent. I clicked on his profile and saw he was 3 years older than me. His profile said he was looking for biological family members. I messaged him through the platform that night. I explained that we'd shown up as half-siblings and asked if he knew anything about our shared parent. He responded the next day with information that turned my world upside down. He'd been adopted at birth and had been searching for his biological parents for years. He'd recently found his biological father through DNA testing. Our biological father was named Thomas Brennan, and he lived about 4 hours away from me. Ryan had met him 6 months earlier. Thomas had told him about a relationship he'd had in college with a nursing student named Linda. She'd gotten pregnant, but decided to stay with her boyfriend and raise the baby as his. That baby was me. I stared at the message for an hour, reading it over and over. My entire life had been built on a lie. The man I called Dad wasn't my father. My mom had gotten pregnant with someone else's baby and convinced her boyfriend to raise me as his own. They'd changed their names, moved across the state, and created an entirely fictional family history to cover it up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about every interaction I'd had with Dad, every time he'd said he loved me, every time I'd introduced him as my father. Had he ever looked at me and resented that I wasn't really his? Had Mom felt guilty every time someone said I looked like her instead of him? The next few days were torture. I went through the motions of school and work, but I felt like I was living in a simulation. Everything familiar suddenly seemed fake. I kept studying my parents' faces, looking for signs that they were lying about other things too. How much of my life was real and how much was carefully constructed fiction? I decided I had to confront them, but I wanted more information first. I messaged Ryan back and asked if he could put me in touch with Thomas. Ryan gave me Thomas's phone number and email address. He said Thomas had been hoping to hear from me for years, but didn't want to disrupt my life by reaching out directly. I called Thomas from the school parking lot during lunch. His voice sounded nervous when he answered. I told him who I was and that I'd found out through DNA testing. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he'd been waiting for this call since I was born. He'd always wondered about me but had agreed to stay away to protect my mom's marriage. Thomas told me the whole story. He and my mom had dated for 2 years in college. They'd talked about getting married after graduation, but Mom was also seeing someone else, the man I knew as my dad. When she got pregnant, she wasn't sure who the father was. She chose to stay with David because he had better job prospects and seemed more stable. Thomas said he'd wanted to be involved in my life, but Mom and David had asked him to sign away his parental rights. They'd promised to tell me the truth when I turned 18. In exchange, Thomas agreed to stay away and let them raise me without interference. He'd moved to another state for work and tried to build a new life, but he'd never stopped thinking about me. He asked if I wanted to meet in person. I said yes without hesitation. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a restaurant halfway between our cities. I told my parents I was going to hang out with friends for the day, another lie to add to the collection our family had built. Thomas was waiting at a corner table when I arrived. I recognized him immediately, even though we'd never met. I had his jawline, his nose, his way of tilting his head when thinking. It was like looking at an older version of myself. He stood up when he saw me, and we shook hands awkwardly. Neither of us knew what to say at first. We spent 3 hours talking. He showed me photos of his life, his job as an engineer, his hobbies. He asked about school, my interests, my plans for college. It felt surprisingly natural considering the circumstances. He was nothing like the man who'd raised me, but I could see myself in his mannerisms and thought processes. Before I left, Thomas gave me a sealed envelope. Inside was every birthday card and Christmas card he'd written to me over the years but never sent. 17 years of letters expressing love for a child he'd never been allowed to know. Some of the early ones were addressed to Baby, since he didn't know what name my parents had given me. Reading through those letters on the drive home broke something inside me. Thomas had been thinking about me my entire life, while I'd had no idea he existed. He'd wanted to be my father, but my mom and the man I called Dad had decided that wasn't what was best for their new family. They'd erased him completely and built their life on the foundation of that erasure. I went straight to my room when I got home and didn't come down for dinner. Mom knocked on my door around 8 and asked if I was feeling okay. I said I had a headache and just wanted to sleep. She offered to bring me soup, but I told her I wasn't hungry. The kindness in her voice made everything worse because I couldn't tell if it was genuine or part of the performance she'd been putting on for 17 years. The next morning at breakfast, I decided I couldn't pretend anymore. I pulled out my phone and showed them the DNA test results. Mom's face went completely white. Dad stared at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Then he set the phone down carefully and asked how long I'd known. I told them everything. The DNA test, finding Ryan, talking to Thomas, meeting him yesterday. With each revelation, Mom looked more devastated and Dad looked more angry. When I finished, Dad accused me of going behind their backs and betraying their trust. He said family business should stay in the family, and I'd had no right to contact strangers and share private information. I lost it at that point. I yelled that Thomas wasn't a stranger, he was my biological father. The man I'd called Dad my entire life was the stranger. I'd been living with people who'd lied to me about the most basic fact of my existence. How could he talk about trust when our entire relationship was built on deception. Mom started crying and tried to explain their reasoning. They'd wanted to give me a stable family. They'd been young and scared and thought they were doing what was best for everyone. Thomas had agreed to the arrangement. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. They'd planned to tell me when I turned 18, but then it never seemed like the right time. Dad said they'd sacrificed everything to raise me as their own. He'd loved me like his biological son. He'd never treated me differently or made me feel unwanted. Why wasn't that enough? Why did I need to destroy our family by digging up the past? I told him it wasn't about destroying anything. It was about honesty, about knowing who I really was, about having the right to know my own father. I asked how they could think 17 years of lies was protecting me. How was finding out by accident as a teenager better than growing up knowing the truth? The fight escalated until we were all screaming. Mom kept apologizing through her tears. Dad kept insisting they'd done nothing wrong. I kept demanding to know what else they'd lied about. Did I have other siblings? Did Thomas's family know about me? How many people were part of this cover-up? Eventually, Dad stormed out of the house. Mom and I sat in the kitchen in silence until she finally started explaining everything. She'd been 19 when she got pregnant. She was scared and overwhelmed. David had offered to marry her and raise the baby as his own. Thomas had been hurt, but eventually agreed it was for the best. They'd moved away to start fresh where no one knew their history. She said changing their names had been David's idea. He'd wanted a complete break from the past. They'd created new identities and new family histories. Over the years, the lies had become so automatic, they'd almost forgotten they weren't true. Every time I'd asked questions, it had gotten harder to know how to tell me without revealing everything. I asked if she'd ever regretted the choice. She was quiet for a long time, then said she'd regretted not being honest with me sooner. She'd never regretted having me or letting David raise me, but she'd always known this day would come. She'd hoped I'd understand why they'd made the decisions they had. That afternoon, Thomas called to check on how the conversation with my parents had gone. I told him about the fight and how angry Dad had become. Thomas said he'd expected that reaction. He'd always known David resented the arrangement, even though it had been his choice to agree to it. Raising another man's child while pretending it was your own couldn't have been easy. Thomas asked if I wanted to stay in contact. He said he understood if I needed time to process everything and didn't want a relationship with him right away, but he'd like the chance to get to know me if I was willing. He also mentioned that I had 2 half-sisters from his marriage 5 years ago. They didn't know about me yet, but he'd like to tell them if I was comfortable with that. The idea of having sisters was overwhelming on top of everything else. My entire family structure had been rewritten in 24 hours. I had a biological father I'd never known existed, a half-brother who'd been searching for me, and potentially 2 more half-siblings I'd never met. Meanwhile, the people who'd raised me felt like strangers. Dad didn't come home that night. Mom said he was staying at his brother's house to cool off. She apologized again for how everything had happened and said she hoped we could work through it as a family. But I wasn't sure what family meant anymore when the foundation had been lies. The next day at school, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My friend Caleb asked if I was okay because I seemed distracted. I ended up telling him everything during lunch. He was shocked but supportive. He said his family was adopted and he'd always known, which seemed much healthier than what my parents had done. When I got home, Dad was back. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Mom, and they both looked like they'd been crying. Dad apologized for storming out and said he'd been thinking about everything I'd said. He admitted they'd handled the situation badly and should have been honest with me years ago. But then he said something that made my blood boil. At the end of the day, I'm still your real father. Biology doesn't change 17 years of raising you. Thomas might be your sperm donor, but I'm the one who taught you to ride a bike and helped with homework and was there for every important moment of your life. I told him he didn't get to decide what made someone a real father after lying to me about who my actual father was for my entire life. Thomas hadn't been absent by choice. He'd been erased by their decision. How was that fair to him or to me? How could Dad claim credit for being there when he'd actively prevented my biological father from being there? The argument started all over again. This time, Mom took my side and told Dad he was being unfair. She said they'd made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. If I wanted a relationship with Thomas, they needed to respect that. If I needed time to figure out how I felt about everything, they needed to give me that space. Dad said he felt like he was losing his son to a stranger. I said he'd never had a son. He'd had someone else's son who didn't know the truth. That distinction mattered, even if he couldn't see it. Biology might not be everything, but honesty was, and they'd taken that away from me. Over the next few weeks, I started talking to Thomas regularly. We texted most days and had long phone calls on weekends. He told me about his work, his interests, his wife and daughters. He sent me photos from his life and asked about mine. It felt like trying to cram 17 years of relationship into a few weeks. Thomas also connected me with Ryan, my half-brother. We started video chatting and discovered we had a lot in common despite growing up in different states with different families. Ryan had gone through his own version of this discovery process when he'd aged out of foster care and started searching for his biological family. At home, things remained tense. Dad was polite, but distant. Mom tried to act normal but seemed constantly worried about saying the wrong thing. I felt like I was living with well-meaning strangers, who'd been playing roles in my life without my knowledge. The breaking point came when I told them I wanted to meet Thomas's wife and daughters. Dad said absolutely not. He said Thomas had already disrupted our family enough, and he wasn't going to let him parade me around like some kind of trophy. Mom tried to mediate, but Dad was adamant. I asked what right he had to control my relationship with my biological father. Dad said he had every right as the man who'd raised me and paid for everything and been there through every crisis. I said those were his choices, not obligations I owed him for. If he'd been honest from the beginning, we could have navigated this together. Instead, he'd created a situation where I had to choose between families. That night, I called Thomas and told him what was happening. He said he'd expected this kind of pushback and didn't want to cause more problems for me at home. But he also said I was 17 and old enough to make my own decisions about relationships. If I wanted to meet his family, he'd support that. The next weekend, I told my parents I was staying overnight at Caleb's house. Instead, I drove 4 hours to Thomas's city. I spent the day with him, his wife Sarah, and my two half-sisters, Emma and Grace. They were 8 and 6, and they'd been told they had a big brother they'd never met. They were excited and curious and completely accepting. Sarah was kind and welcoming. She said Thomas had told her about me years ago when they'd first started dating. She'd always hoped I'd reach out someday. She showed me photos of Thomas from over the years and pointed out how much we looked alike. She said Emma had my same stubborn streak, and Grace had inherited Thomas's analytical mind. Being with Thomas's family felt natural in a way that surprised me. There was no awkwardness or forced conversation. Emma and Grace treated me like they'd known me forever. Thomas seemed more relaxed than he had during our first meeting. Sarah made dinner and we all sat around the table talking and laughing. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. These people were my family too, and they wanted me there. There was no guilt or resentment or complicated history to navigate, just acceptance and genuine affection. I drove home the next day feeling more conflicted than ever. I loved my half-sisters immediately and could see building a real relationship with Thomas and Sarah. But that would mean continuing to lie to my parents and creating more distance in our already strained relationship. When I walked into the house, Mom was waiting in the living room. She asked how my night with Caleb had been, and I could tell from her voice that she suspected something. I decided I was done with lies and told her where I'd really been. Her face crumpled and she started crying again. Dad came into the room and demanded to know what was wrong. When Mom told him, his face went red with anger. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. He said I was destroying our family for people who were essentially strangers. He said Thomas had given up his rights as a father and didn't deserve to waltz back into my life and play happy family. I told him Thomas hadn't given up anything willingly. He'd been pressured into signing away his rights by parents who'd wanted to erase him from my life. Thomas had been thinking about me every day for 17 years. He'd written me letters he couldn't send and missed milestones he wasn't allowed to celebrate. How was that giving up? Dad said it didn't matter what Thomas's motivations had been. What mattered was that he'd made a choice, and they'd all lived with the consequences. Now I was trying to rewrite history and pretend the last 17 years hadn't happened. He said I was being manipulated by people who wanted to break up our family. I asked how our family could be broken up by the truth when it had been built on lies. I said, maybe it needed to be broken up, so something honest could be built instead. Dad said, if that's how I felt, maybe I should go live with my real family and see how that worked out. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mom gasped and told Dad he'd gone too far. But I was done with the arguments and manipulation and emotional blackmail. I said maybe I would. Maybe I'd see what it was like to live with people who didn't lie to me about fundamental facts of my existence. That night, I called Thomas and told him about the fight. He said I was welcome to visit any time, but he didn't want to encourage me to run away from home or damage my relationship with the people who'd raised me. He said family was complicated, and sometimes it took time to work through difficult situations. But I'd made up my mind. The next day, I started researching what it would take to finish high school in Thomas's city. I had enough money saved from work to buy a plane ticket. I could stay with Thomas and Sarah until I turned 18 and could make my own legal decisions. When I told my parents my plan, Mom begged me not to leave. She said we could work through this as a family if I'd just give them time. Dad said if I left, I shouldn't expect him to pay for college or support me financially. He said actions had consequences, and I was choosing to abandon the family that had sacrificed for me. I packed my clothes and important documents that night. Caleb helped me carry everything to his car and drove me to the airport the next morning. My parents didn't try to stop me, but Mom cried when she hugged me goodbye. Dad didn't say anything at all. Thomas picked me up at the airport and drove me to his house. Emma and Grace were excited to have their big brother staying with them. Sarah had prepared a room for me and enrolled me in the local high school. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Living with Thomas's family was everything I'd hoped it would be. There was no tension or walking on eggshells or wondering what else they might be hiding from me. We talked openly about everything, including how complicated the situation was and how sorry Thomas was that it had taken 17 years for us to meet. I finished my senior year at the new school and graduated with honors. Thomas and Sarah came to the ceremony along with Emma and Grace. It was the first time I'd had my real family there for a major milestone. Ryan drove down from his city to be there too, bringing his girlfriend and their baby daughter. My mom called the night before graduation and asked if she and Dad could come. I said they were welcome, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was normal or hide the fact that Thomas was there. She said they'd decided to stay home, but wanted me to know they were proud of me. Dad didn't get on the phone. After graduation, I enrolled in the state university near Thomas's house. He and Sarah offered to help with tuition and expenses. I got a part-time job and settled into life as part of their family. Emma and Grace treated me like their full brother, not their half-brother. Sarah included me in family decisions and traditions. The legal complications were resolved when I turned 18. I had my birth certificate amended to reflect Thomas as my biological father. I changed my last name from Murphy back to Chen, which was actually David's real name, then to Brennan to match Thomas. It felt like reclaiming my identity after years of living under false pretenses. Thomas and I talked extensively about the lost years and how to move forward. He never spoke badly about Mom and David, even though he'd been hurt by their decision to cut him out of my life. He said he understood they'd been young and scared and trying to do what they thought was best. He didn't want our relationship to be built on resentment toward them. Mom called occasionally during my first year of college. Our conversations were stilted and careful, like we were talking to acquaintances rather than family. She'd ask about school and work, and I'd give brief updates. She'd tell me about their life, and I'd listen politely. We never talked about the deeper issues or what had really happened between us. Dad didn't call at all for almost 2 years. When he finally reached out, it was to tell me he'd been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to make peace before he started treatment. He apologized for his reaction and said he'd been wrong to try to control my relationship with Thomas. He said he'd acted out of fear of losing me and hadn't considered how his choices had affected me. I drove back to visit him during his treatment. We had several honest conversations about what had happened and why. He admitted that raising me had been more complicated than he'd expected, because I'd reminded him constantly that I wasn't really his son. He'd loved me but also resented the situation he'd agreed to. He'd taken that resentment out on me when the truth came out, which wasn't fair. David recovered from his cancer, and he and Mom moved across the country to be closer to his brother's family. We exchange Christmas cards now and text occasionally on birthdays. The relationship isn't what it was before, but it's honest in a way it never was when I was growing up. We all understand that some damage can't be completely repaired, but we can choose to stop causing more damage. Thomas and I have built the father-son relationship we missed out on for the first 17 years of my life. It's different from what it would have been if we'd known each other from the beginning, but it's real and based on truth. Emma and Grace are the sisters I never knew I wanted, and Sarah has become like a second mother to me. Ryan and I stay in touch regularly and visit each other a few times a year. He's married now with 3 kids, and I'm Uncle Michael to his children. We joke that we're making up for lost time as siblings, but we both know we can't really recover what we never had. We can only build something new from where we are now. I graduated college with a degree in engineering, following in Thomas's footsteps. He walked me across the stage at graduation, and Emma and Grace cheered from the audience. Sarah cried with pride like I was her own son. It was the family celebration I'd always wanted but never had growing up. Now I work for the same company as Thomas in a different department. We have lunch together most days and work on projects around his house on weekends. I'm teaching Emma to drive and helping Grace with her math homework. I'm part of a family that's honest about who we are and how we got here, even when the story is complicated and painful. The experience taught me that family is about more than biology, but it's also about more than just showing up and claiming credit. It's about honesty and respect and giving people the information they need to make their own choices about relationships. It's about acknowledging that love isn't enough if it's built on deception, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's hard.